It's top of the hour. Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Patton, and we're here to talk about vRealize automation and NSX, and to see some use cases of how these integrate together to provide a well-formed VM deployment that provides integration with networking and deployment, and also decommissioning those solutions as well, and what that entails. So I have some introductory comments and some material that we just want to set the foundation for, and then I have a live environment that we'll be working in. So I'm excited about that because this is more, to me, a working session of what we can learn together in our 45 minutes together. It's not a lot of time. So I'll be going through some of the components so as to get to the demo as efficiently as possible. Okay. I'll be available for questions. If there are questions that come up, feel free to ask. If I feel that we want to defer them to the end, we'll do that. Just depends on the type of question and how quickly I can answer it. So, as I said, my name is Michael Patton, and I'm a staff advanced customer engagement architect with VMware. And I've been with VMware since 2012, so I'm coming up on almost 7 years with VMware, and I'm very excited about that. I'm very proud to work for VMware, longtime champion of VMware, going back to the early 2000s. And my previous time with VMware, PSO, customer success, so I have a lot of field experience with customers working with these products. Based in the Midwest, and I'd probably say most of my time with VMware has been customer-facing with PSO engagements with the vRealize suite. So that could encompass vRealize automation, VRops, Operations Manager, Log Insight, those types of products. Okay, so what we're here to talk about today is digital transformation and automation, kind of some introductory comments, app-centric networking and security, the secure two-tier app development demo, and then some quick summary and additional resources. Because really what I want to see out of this is, where do you go next with this information, and how does this impact your environment? And that's what I'm most excited about, and why I want to be able to show you what this looks like. So before we begin, I'd like to just reference a couple of things. Again, I'm just excited about VMware. We have some slides, marketing slides. VMware is a force for good. I'm just excited still, after almost 7 years, each day I kind of pinch myself that I work for a great company, very excited. And thank you for being here at this VMUG, and I think that just shows it more as well. So I appreciate that. Again, some of our Epic 2 values that we see: execution, passion, integrity, customers, and community. And this is also reflected if you looked at a lot of the notes of our footprint in the environment, our grants that we provide to universities, to lots of different organizations that help the community. So very excited about that. And so what we're talking about here with digital transformation and data center evolution, and by the way, I'm just going to stop here just for a second and just show a show of hands. How many people here are running a version of vRealize automation? Okay, all right, a few. And how about NSX, whether that be V or T? Okay, all right. And is there anyone that's actually blending them together, integrating them together right now? Okay, yeah, absolutely. So great. Let's see how we can bridge those two together and see some powerful use cases that I'd like to share. So thank you for that feedback. What I'd like to do now is just set the stage with digital transformation. The idea of ongoing innovation, extremely important. I think everyone in this room can appreciate how we have less of budget, we have less of resources, and the ask of innovation continues to increase every week. Same thing with speed to market, as well as higher expectations. So there's a lot of pressure for every one of us in this room. Some of the roadblocks that we see that begins to set the foundation of why vRealize automation and NSX makes so much sense is the manual process that we face every day when resources are being requested of us, and how we need to procure those resources. The physical networks and the provisioning of the infrastructure and application components that basically make those solutions up for your end users, your customers, your internal customers. So those are 3 roadblocks that we see. And especially with vRealize automation, the idea there is vRealize automation is about automating that end-to-end process. You'll hear me reference more than once a well-formed VM. All of us can provision rather quickly a VM or multiple VMs without issue. But that doesn't get us very far because we have to integrate DNS, DHCP, or static IP addresses, multiple NICs IP addresses, CMDB registration, backup. All of those different components that I define as a well-formed VM is extremely important. And that is a lengthy conversation with customers because it causes them to sit down and think, what am I doing manually? And some things customers don't even think about it. It's just part of what they've done time after time. And so what we really try to do is to cause them to think through that process. And we've had really good results of that. Okay. So those are some of the roadblocks. What we see from an automation and making agility possible is to virtual compute expanded to all applications, the storage transformation, aligning with app demands management, as well as virtualize the network for speed of efficiency. And that's where we get our software-defined networking. And so when we talk about vRealize automation and the automation and the provisioning process, that well-formed VM, and then bringing in that networking, what we'll see in future slides is the idea there is that the networking is a missing piece. When we think of firewall, when we think of port configuration, when we think of load balancers, right, all of those different things, when I work with customers, sometimes when we deploy at a vRealize automation environment, and we need to do that in high availability, and you know, a typical load balancer might be NetScaler or F5. It's really company by company how difficult it is to implement that F5. Even though simple configuration, a lot of thought has to go into that in planning. And so my whole point here is that how can we streamline this? How can we make this easier? And through that level of automation that we'll demonstrate today, I think we'll have a good use case for that. Just some customer highlights here from Sugar Creek. Basically just calling out some of the work that VMware has done with this company and some of the great thing that's come out of it. Specifically their way of streamlining their software-defined data center. And so as we start to get into the details of what we're facing when we start looking at vRealize automation and NSX is this idea of the security realities. And what we're saying here is that whether we have low priority systems, some of the risks that we might find in the environment. You know, I think those are self-explanatory, but also one of these security realities is that we see as a time factor to implement. Some companies really find it, they can provision machines, they can get 80% there, and then sometimes it's, you know what, I gotta wait 2 weeks for firewall ports to be open. And then I have to test those firewall ports, and if they're not working right, then I have to troubleshoot that, and that's an extra week and a half, maybe 2 weeks. That's a reality that we just face as a company. So when we start to look at some of those things from a security perspective, from a procurement perspective, all of these goes into what our current situation is. What we're asking for is in this zero trust model with a software-defined networking with NSX, we're asking ourselves, okay, can we do this better? Can we do this faster? Can we do this more efficient? And the answer is yes. We can do that by utilizing NSX for individual firewalls and individual security policies. What we see when we look at the individual firewalls, the security groups, the network security groups, as well as the policies that are associated with those security groups, what we see is a more granular level of control, of mitigating risk, and being able to isolate and work with those different solutions in your environment in a prescriptive way. And some of the ways that we can do that based upon VM attributes. The second portion is down. Policies can be defined on any context. That's just a few of them. So the idea here is when you start thinking about where and how you want to organize your resources, think about it from an AD perspective and how you organize your OU. You can organize your OU in lots of different ways, how you organize your AD groups in lots of different ways based upon function, geo, all of those different attributes. The same attributes here is we can apply to the software-defined networking with NSX. And so by having this example here with a PCI scope is that subset of VMs that give you that granular level of control based upon firewall and policies. Okay. Another call out here from National Commercial Bank with regards to NSX. And again, to highlight the difficulty that we see here in just progressing through this slide, what we're saying here is that we have our compute, we have our storage, we have our package development, you have your developers, they're able to promote from a dev environment to a production environment. You know, they have all that set up, but in this middle portion here of networking security, that is the hurdle that we're presenting in this situation is one of the main roadblocks that we need to overcome. And if you can get through to be able to automate your load balancers, automate your firewall ports, automate your security as part of that well-formed VM process, you're going to have a huge return and level of innovation that I think we're all striving for. And that's what we're illustrating here. And so with that, we're just saying we're reducing that time to minutes. Now, from a realistic perspective, you know, you can say minutes, but in an enterprise global company, when we've done a level of automation, sometimes our time to provision resources can be up to maybe 2 hours. If you can get it under that, great, but that's a very realistic SLA for a very complex deployment that is touching probably 5 to 10 different systems in that solution deployment. Okay? So when we talk about minutes, it's all depending on what you're integrating with. And it also depends on the quality of the systems that you're integrating to. So if I'm connecting to a CMDB, and that CMDB third party has nothing to do from the automation perspective within vRealize automation, you know, if you're having difficulties with that CMDB and during the provisioning process that machine can't register that CMDB, we have issues. So there's a lot of interdependencies there that we encounter with this. And we're saying here in this slide is just the networking and security really finishes out some of those components, and it really just streamlines that process. Before I go on any further, any thoughts, any questions of what vRealize automation does at a very high level and what we're trying to accomplish with NSX? Okay, all right, okay. What I like about this slide and this call out from IHS Marquette is something that I think needs to be emphasized, and we'll talk about that in our demo, that when you go to provision a solution, that's great, but we also need to talk about decommissioning that solution, and that's something that we face all the time. We can build it, but do we ever get those resources back? And the answer is, with this approach and this use case, we'll actually show you how that actually brings back those resources into your SDDC so as others can consume them later on. So decommissioning is an extremely important process. And in fact, in preparation for our talk today, I actually want to emphasize that because I decommissioned an environment, and I just want to show you the building and the decommissioning. So we'll show that. Okay. All right. All right, so here, when we talk about our solution, we're talking about network virtualization, and we're talking about automation. So from an automation perspective, I've talked about VRA, vRealize automation, and that end-to-end process. We'll jump into the demo here in just a minute, and as well as the NSX portion with the network virtualization, decoupling the networking security from the physical infrastructure. That's one of the great things that we see from an NSX perspective. Okay. All right, and automation brings all that acceleration and savings together. I think that's obvious of what we're talking about here. And when we look at the application-centric networking and security services here, there's a lot of different aspects, because one of the things I find that those that are involved in the SDDC, when I work with customers, I ask them, let's say we're dealing from a VROPS perspective or you're provisioning a solution, either way, I ask the question, tell me about the applications that you're supporting in your SDDC. And one of the things that I find is sometimes that's tough because we're all overworked in some ways, and our job is to keep the lights on. And when I start asking questions about the granularity of those applications, Sometimes that needs a little bit of work. And so what we're saying here is by looking at automation, this application-centric networking security services, it allows you that opportunity to really engage your developers, to engage your application owners, to understand that application better, because as you start to provide that level of automation and that service, you'll get to know that application in a better way. And these are some of the components that go into that: the app-specific networking configuration, security policies, the dynamic app availability configuration, and the app-specific networking performance. So all of these different things are what we see with a segmented network here, from a routing from a layer 1, from a layer 2, a configuration from a security perspective. All of these go into that solution. Okay. When we look at integrating with vRealize automation and NSX, key component here is what we're looking at is, from a vRealize automation perspective, we have a unified catalog, and I'll show you what that catalog looks like. But in that catalog, we have security, networking, applications, and extensibility. All of that comes a part of that converged blueprint. Remember, with vRealize automation, you are providing a self-service portal. And that self-service portal could be to a developer group. It also could be just to the internal operations team. So who provisions VMs is a big question that you need to ask as well. And here we talk about connectivity, availability, and security. And we'll talk more about those in the demo. All right, so what I want to do right now is I just want to call out what we're building. And so I want to just show you what we're doing first. So what we're building in this live environment is we have set up the framework where we have our blueprints. Those are our VMs, our database. Nothing's provisioned yet, but they're there in blueprint form in a self-service catalog. We have our networking. We have our load balancer. All right, and we have a two-arm load balancer that we're referencing here. And so here we see the default external network, and we see behind this a one-to-many NAT configuration. And I'll go through all that configuration here next. But this is what we're building. Okay. Oh, and by the way, we've got the security groups in here as well. Okay. All right, so I'm going to now transition over to our environment. Now, in our environment, there are two users that we're highlighting here. There's a cloud admin, who's the administrator, and we have a dev user, who is the consumer. And so my first demonstration here is I'd like to look at this from the cloud admin's perspective. Okay? And the situation is, all right, we need to build out a solution like we just previously talked about and provide that to the dev user. And so the way that we go about this in this interface is we go to the Design tab. And in the Design tab, we have our different blueprints. Now I have a blueprint here that we can leverage. And I'm just going to copy this blueprint over and start new in the configuration. And so I'm going to copy this. And I'll call this just demo VMUG, and click OK. And I'm just going to look at this just for a few minutes, because what you can see is we've got the default framework that we have set up. So we've got our default external network, we've got our web server and our database server. But inside of that web server and database server, there we have our applications. I just want to take a second and I want to just step back and say, okay, I'm just going to come out of this for a second, because I really want to show you where those applications are coming from, because we're talking about that end-to-end provisioning. Provisioning the VM, provisioning the VM, the OS, the networking, the application, everything end-to-end, that well-formed. So here, what I just want to just call out here is these are the software components. And here we have our WordPress services, our database, our WordPress site config. All of these represent the applications that we're overlaying. It's basically a drag and drop. We're actually going to just drag and drop a lot of those components on the networking side. But what I wanted to show you here is this. This is what is behind the scenes when we go to deploy that application. We have a bash script, and this basically then calls out the different installations of the applications. And this is the typical way that we would use application installation from within vRealize automation. So I just wanted to show that as context of why and how did we get to the blueprint here with respect to this blueprint, and how did those applications come in here? Well, they came in here because here's the software components. I can just drag and drop those, okay? But what we're wanting to do now is that as a base is we're wanting to drag and drop all of the networking components on here. So the way that we start this is we want to start with the security groups. And we want to overlay those security groups on top of the web server and the database server. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the existing security group and I'm just going to drag this over here. That's one. And I'm now going to do a second one. And I will bring this down a little bit so we can see. Okay. All right. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this security group and I'm going to associate it with a predefined group that we have. And I'm going to just keep this simple and just do over HTTP, so port 80. And so I'll select that security group and I'll go to the second one. And that's going to be the database. So I'll choose MySQL. And so now that I have those two security groups, I'm now going to associate them with the appropriate web server, with the appropriate server. So here we see our web server, and here's our build information. So here's our template information, the different machine resources, and what we're going to do is we're going to go over to security, and we're basically going to associate that web server. And when I do that, we're going to have a dotted line next to that machine. Okay, now, yep, okay. And I'll come over here, and I'm going to do the same thing over here to the database server. Come over to the security, MySQL. So what I've done now is I've associated the security group with the appropriate web server. And that's now part of the blueprint. So when this blueprint gets provisioned, I will have an association of security groups. But remember, the next thing that we want to do is we have to bring in that NATed network. Right? So now I'm going to bring in this NATed network over here. I'm going to drag and drop. And right now, the web server and database server are configured to the external. Well, I need to change that. So I'm going to just configure this NAT network to the one-to-many NAT. And by doing that, I now set up here to be able to then grab this here. And so what I'm going to do now, just like I did with the security group, I'm now associating this web server to the appropriate network. And remember, with that two-arm load balancer that we're going to be adding in next, so I'm associating, I'm changing from the default external network to the NAT. Click OK. Come over here to the database server. I'll do the same. Come over to my network. Change this to one-to-many NAT. Click OK. And make sure I save. OK. So what we have here is we have the two web servers, we have our default network, we have security groups, and we've now also associated the one-to-many NAT with the web server and the database server. So my next step is to bring over the load balancer. And by bringing over the load balancer, I'm saying, okay, well, what do I want that load balancer to be a member of? And I'm going to say the web server. All right? So I'm associating with the web server. I'm going to choose the member network, which is the one-to-many NAT. But here is the key. The VIP network. Remember, the VIP network of how we're going to then connect to it is going to be the default external. That gives us our two-arm load balancer. Okay? The next step that I'm going to do is I have to create that virtual server. Now, when I say I create this virtual server, I'm not creating it just yet. All I'm saying is I'm just putting down the foundation, the blueprint. All right? As we go to create this, it will dynamically create all of this. Okay? And let's see, what am I doing here? Okay, we've got that. That looks good. Save that. That looks good. Okay, so here we have our one-to-many NAT. Here we have our load balancer. And here is there's our two arms. So there's our default network, and there is our connection to our web server. And so from here, I will simply now click Finish. And now that I have this blueprint ready to go, it's in draft form. I simply need to publish this to make that available. So let's just transition just for a second. Let me just pause. Any thoughts or questions? Yes?
Yeah, so I'm not a VRA guy.
No problem.
I'm NSX, becoming an NSX guy.
Perfect.
So the security groups,
Yes.
have like hit days.
Yes.
Is it here like a drop-down box where you just decide what security group needs to be assigned, or is it like templates or blueprints?
That's a good question. You can actually go both ways.
Okay.
But here's the question. How much do you want your end users to be able to choose? It really depends on who is. Let's say it's operations. They're probably familiar with security groups. So you might want to make that as a drop-down menu in your request process, which I'll show you in just a little while. Let's say it's the dev users. You may not want to give them those kind of choices. So you might want to have that built in. So it just all depends. Great question. Other thoughts before we move on?
One more question.
Yes.
The permission sets, I guess it would be both vCenter and NSX, the role in NSX to get access to the security group.
Yes. Yes. There was a question. Yeah, great question. This is a hands-on lab, and we just haven't upgraded yet. Good question. One more comment on that. Principles are the same. I know. I struggle with that too. Yeah. Okay. All right. So from an administrative perspective, what we've done is we have created that blueprint. Now we're ready to publish that. We're going to go ahead and publish that blueprint. So here we see our two-tier WordPress blueprint that now you've just made available to that particular dev user. It could be a group. You can get extremely granular from a vRealize automation perspective of what you see in the service catalog. And so what this looks like now is I can now come over here and request this, whether I'm for the operations or the dev user, and I can say, okay, I can give selected here 1 to 30, but when that lease expires, that machine will go into a number of different states. It could be destroyed, it could go into archive. There's a lot of different things, but the idea here is you're going to reclaim resources at the end when this needs to be decommissioned. Obviously, this would be a dev environment. Obviously, you wouldn't have leases on production, but you get my point there. So we're doing a web server and a database server, and all these different applications and the networking that's going to support that. All right. So by taking all this into account and the different components here, we would go ahead and click Submit, and then it would provision. For time purposes, what we're going to do, and we're doing good on time. We got 15 minutes left. We're now at the point where the machine is provisioning. Okay? It takes about, in this live environment, it takes about 15 minutes. What I've done is, let's assume, fast forward, the machine is provisioned. Well, what we have from the dev user's perspective is we have right over here we have items. You know what, let's look at requests first, because requests are important here because, and I'm going to filter this so we don't see a lot of noise here. And so what I'm showing you right now is request number 66. We'll go ahead and go into this. And this is what we start to see with a successful provisioned environment, this solution. And just like we saw in the request phase, here is what we see the end product. Now, what we see is that we can go to the execution information, and these are all the steps that it goes through during the provisioning process. So this is where we created the one-to-many NAT. That did not exist before on that edge in NSX. Now it does. It was created. The edge, the security group. Now, the security group was predefined, but we did select that. We associated that as part of the provisioning process. The web server, the on-demand load balancer, all of these different components we see during the process. We also have an accounting of how long those took and things related to that. If anything should fail, you could be able to troubleshoot that. And I do have an example of that as well to see what an error might look like. But this is what you would see with that provisioning process. So in that provisioning process, we come over here to items, and we'll come over here, and we'll drill down underneath this. Remember, in vRealize automation, in this type of scenario, we have a parent container. It's not a VM, but it's a parent container. And this parent container then holds all the different constructs that we see. And so the first thing I want to point out is our two machines, dev 25 and 26, our database server, our IP address. All right, remember that's our NAT IP address. And then here is our load balancer. So what would the dev user connect to is 110.214. Okay, let's see. And just real quick here, 192. 168, 110. I think that was 214, I think. All right? And so 110, 214. So that is what they would then connect to. All right? Now, one of the things that we see within this environment, now that we've provisioned this machine, is what are some day two operations that we can leverage? So I can select this web server, and in this, I have the ability. Now note, that list of things, connect to a VMRC console, create snapshot, all of these are editable in the sense of, look, if you don't want people shutting down their machines that they provision, don't worry about it. You can take all that away. But if you want to have some day two operations, you can certainly take advantage of that. And so if we wanted to, we could power off, we could power cycle, and all of these different components. And if you wanted to go one step further and say, okay, there's extensibility, you can add in extensibility in here, and let's say a VRO workflow that basically says, oh, you know what, I'd love to add this to the backup job. All right, we talked about Veeam in the previous session. That's one of the plugins that you can leverage from VRO inside of vRealize automation to set that as an actionable day two operation. Okay. All right, so that's just from a VM perspective. Now, one of the other day two operations we have is on this on-demand load balancer. We do have the ability to reconfigure this load balancer. Now, I originally created this with HTTP, but you do have the ability to edit this and change that over to port 80 if you wanted to. All right? So we're not going to change anything here, but just know that that is a day two operation that we could take advantage of. Okay? So what that web page looks like, if it rendered, yeah, it's just a basic static web page that we illustrate there. And so the idea here is that we have provisioned a well-formed VM to a dev user and all of these different components. And so what I'd like to do next is I want to go behind the scenes from what do you see from a vCenter perspective. And so I'm going to switch. Now we're on dev user now. I'm going to switch over to vRealize automation from the cloud admin perspective. cloud admin perspective, and let's go to vCenter. Okay, so what's going on from a vCenter perspective? There we go. Okay, I refreshed. All right, I want to look at the NSX constructs, and I want to look at and show you the layer 2 logical network, the NAT network. All of those different components which didn't exist before have been created. And then the other thing, while we're waiting for this screen to refresh, let's talk about the decommissioning process. So if I was to decommission, I believe, yeah, I decommissioned as the dev user. Let's come over here to requests. And here we see a destroy. So this is one that I did. Let's see, yeah, this one was successful. So here we see the same process in the execution information, which we saw earlier, was the provisioning of all these resources, the networking, the application, the OS, all of these different. Now we're doing the opposite. This could be based upon a lease expired. This could be, hey, you know what, the dev user, it's been 3-4 days, they've done their testing, they're done, and they want to be done with this. So they destroy this environment. And it successfully goes out and reclaims those resources, both at IP, networking, deassociates security group. All of that is automated to reclaim those resources. So I wanted to show you what that decommission process looked like. Okay. All right, so I'm going to come back to vCenter. And under vCenter, we'll navigate here to networking security. I should actually come back here. So let's come back to hosting computers. Okay. There's our dev 25, 26, and there's our edge. Okay. And so with that from host computers, then we come to networking security. And I'll just show you the configuration that we see with the load balancer. So if I come over to my edges, and from here we'll be able to select and drill down into that dynamically created edge right here, 12. Click into here. Here's all the different configurations that we can see. So hopefully I didn't, yeah, there we go. We could take a look at our NAT, but let's just look from a load balancer. This load balancer didn't exist before, but we do and have, there's our service monitoring. So there's our health checks that we could leverage. Let's see. Yeah, it's still refreshing. There's 4 health checks that you could have chosen. Here's our pool and our virtual server. And our virtual server should have an IP address there when it refreshes. We've already been there. We've already seen that in there, but it would be presented here as well. Okay. All right. So we'll let that refresh. Before we continue, any thoughts or questions of what we've demonstrated so far? It's a question.
So for the load balancer, can you, across multiple blueprints, can you leverage the same load balancer, or will it provision a new load balancer each?
It provisions a new load balancer each and every time.
And then the second thing, when you do the decommission, do you have to build a blueprint for that, or does it use a blueprint and then decommissions based on what's been provisioned?
It decommissions based upon what's been provisioned. Good questions. Yes?
If I decommission, but my dev department comes back and say, hey, I need that environment back.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you get that same exact environment back?
Yeah, so that's what's called an archive period. So when that lease expires, or you expire it yourself, which is different than destroy. Destroy is going to destroy it. But in those 2 instances, expired situation, it goes into archive state. I typically recommend 2 weeks for customers. You can do it longer, you can do it shorter, but 2 weeks is a good length of PTO that people would be gone on vacation, so I like to keep it at 14 days. And what happens is the machines just shut down, and then if they come back and says, oh, I didn't mean that to be, expired, I didn't know that lease expired or whatever, you just turn it back on, you're good. You could extend the lease as well. Good question, yeah. Okay, yes?
So if you have a dynamic security tag that, outside of VRA, can you have as part of the blueprint to assure that it's part of that as it's being provisioned or post-provisioned, or not at all?
Yes, Yes, so what I'm hearing you say is that the question is dynamic creation of security groups. Okay, so that would be handled from a VRO perspective. Typically you would handle it from VRO perspective with a workflow. You'd probably have to fill in all those different constructs of, who needs to be a part of the security group, what ports, all of that, then it goes into the service composer as well. And you could just script that based upon a workflow when you go to request that machine. It just becomes a subcomponent of that. So it's a little bit more complex. What we like to do is to have that pre-created, but there are some companies that have asked, hey, how about dynamic security groups? That's a little bit tougher to challenge to solve because of the automation, but it's certainly something that's doable. Yeah. Yes?
Actions on a load balancer, can you also limit what actions can be done there, or is it just full actions that you only make?
That's a good question, granular level. I don't know top of mind. That's a good question. I don't know. But if you, after we conclude, if you give me your name, I'll be more than happy to follow up with you. Good question. As I'm thinking that question through, just really quickly, I'm thinking of a role in vCenter/NSX that, let's just say they just wanted to change the port. I would be looking at that, and then hopefully I would expect that to be translated into as a day 2 action. One other thought, what you could do is you could create a VRO workflow that basically automated the only task that you wanted them to do, and then you could have that as a solution. So those are a couple ways that I would respond. Yeah, if you could in granular level, because I don't think you probably can, because it's probably all or nothing. Out of the box is what we're seeing here. But does that begin to start to answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Other thoughts?
Does it tie into a physical load balancer instead of NSX
Yeah.
using its own load balancer?
Yeah. So the question is, you're asking about a physical load balancer, F5, NetScaler. Yeah. So let's just say F5. Yeah. So basically what you can do is you can create a VRO workflow with a plugin. Solve Labs have them. There's lots of different ways to get those plugins. But basically you could do the same thing with an F5, whether that's opening up port firewalls or creating the load balancers. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Even to the extent, one more comment on that, is even to the extent at the perimeter. There was a whole NAT solution that we did with duplicate environments, and we had to edit rules at the perimeter that was recorded as well, and you could certainly do that.
But you need always NSX platform. Do you need always NSX platform?
No. You just need some sort of scripting into the F5, which is done typically through vRealize Orchestrator. Yep. Okay. All right. I've got about 2 more minutes left. If there's no thoughts or questions, what we've talked about today is the automation, vRealize automation and NSX integration to be able to provision a well-formed VM that essentially ties in security groups, NAT, load balancers, and in one solution be able to provision that. So I'm very excited about this topic and where we can go with that. And I hope you are too. And if you have any questions, feel free to come up afterwards. I'll be more than happy to give my contact information and continue the discussion. Thank you so much for coming.